This is a guide to help you answer questions for the National 5 Modern Studies exam. Today we will discuss how to answer decision-making questions. There are two types of questions in your Modern Studies exam: knowledge and understanding, which require you to show how much you remember about the topics you've studied, and inquiry skills, which use sources. Decision-making is drawn from the inquiry skills section. Decision-making questions are worth 10 marks. You will get a decision-making question in one section of your final exam. The purpose of these questions is simple. It is to choose between two options, giving reasons and evidence for your decision. You will be given 3 sources of information. You must use all 3. As has been noted, these questions are worth 10 marks. You must give evidence both for the chosen option and against the rejected option. If you only give evidence for and fail to give points against, you will gain a maximum of 8 marks. You will also lose marks if you do not use all sources at least once. You should also name the source where you found each piece of evidence. When you answer, you should start off by writing the heading Recommendation and then clearly state the option you are choosing, option 1 or option 2. You should then write the subheading Arguments for Recommendation and then give a quote or piece of evidence from one source and then support this with evidence from a second source. You should aim to do this 3 or 4 times. Each time you give a relevant fact from a source, you will gain 1 mark. Therefore, 3 of these examples would be worth 6 marks, or 4 of these examples would be worth 8 marks. Finally, you should write Arguments against other option as a subheading, and then give a quote to support the rejected option, and disprove this with evidence from a different source. You should aim to do this twice or once. In total, your answer should have 5 paragraphs, each with 2 source facts in them, giving 10 marks. Therefore, you can give 3 for and 2 against, or 4 for and 1 against. Remember, you should not repeat evidence. Once you have used a particular quote or statistic, you will not be credited for repeating it. Let's look at an example question. In this case, we are discussing whether to keep compulsory voting in Australia or to get rid of this. The question reminds you that you should 1. State the option you would choose, 2. Give reasons to support your choice, 3. Explain why you did not choose the other option. You are also reminded that your answer must be based on all 3 sources. Source 1 is facts and quotes from an Australian newspaper. Source 2 is statistics about the countries with and without compulsory voting. Source 3 is taken from an online news company and includes statistics and quotes. When we write our answer, we start off with our recommendation. In this case, we've said, I recommend option 1, keep compulsory voting in Australia. We then move on to consider our first piece of evidence for. When we read source 1, we see that statement that it is widely supported by the Australian people. Therefore, we write our subheading, Arguments for Recommendation, and we write, one reason to recommend option 1 is that source 1 says it's widely supported by the Australian people. We would gain 1 mark for this. Because we want to back it up with another fact, we then look at source 3. In this case, we see a statistic that proves that 65% of Australians want to keep compulsory voting. Clearly, this links to our first point. Therefore, we gain a 2nd mark by including this fact to back up the one we previously gained. Please note, both times source 1 and source 3 are identified as the origin for the fact. We want to repeat this 3 or 4 times. We can either give 3 arguments for a recommendation or 4 arguments for a recommendation. Having done this, we now need to consider arguments against the other option. When we read source 1, we see the argument that it is undemocratic to force people to vote as it is against freedom of choice. Therefore, we write the subheading, Arguments Against Other Option, and we explain that people who support option 2 argue that people who are not interested in politics should not be forced to vote, shown in source 1. We would gain 1 mark for this. However, when we look at source 2, we see that countries with compulsory voting have a much higher turnout than countries without. As a result, we include this statistic to show that in fact, even though many people argue compulsory voting is not positive, there are strong arguments in favour. For providing the second piece of evidence, we gain a 2nd mark. Again, please note source 1 and source 2 clearly identified as the origin of the facts. Once more, we want to repeat this twice or once. If we have written 3 arguments for the option, then we want 2 against. And if we have written 4 arguments in favour of our option, we want 1 against. Each of these is worth 2 marks, giving us 10 marks overall. Here is an overall summary answer. We start off with our recommendation, where we clearly state the option we recommend. We then move on to give evidence for our recommendation. We write the subheading, we give a fact to support it, and support this with a point from elsewhere. We do this 3 times. Finally, we give evidence against the other option. We write this as a subheading, then we show the facts that people who support option 2 will argue, but we disprove this with a fact from another source. In this case, we repeat it twice, giving us our 10 marks overall. National 5 Modern Studies exam, how to answer decision-making questions. It's really that simple.